All right, Rabosai, good morning. Our shir is dedicated this morning by Greg and Rachel Levitan with Hakar Satov to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in honor of the engagement of their daughter, Adina Yehudit, to Baruch Rees of Monsey, New York. Mazel Tov. Mazel Tov. Mazel Tov. Two beautiful simchas in the shir in 1 week. Incredible. All right, so let's begin. Today's daf is Pei Beis 82. We are picking up on Pei Aleph Amud Beis 81b, and we're picking up Amrli Rabbi Zera L'Rabba Bar Shilta 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So again, just reorient ourselves a little bit. We're in the middle of the machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and Ben Nanos. Specifically, again, we have a get makusher. We have a get, again, remember the special get written for short-tempered kohanim. Remember, that's actually the get that was used for all kohanim, assuming that all kohanim had a short fuse. So we go ahead and we write this get with the multiple folds, have multiple witnesses sign. So there are certain leniencies built into this get in terms of the nature of witnesses. The shaila is, how far do we extend the leniency? So Ben Nanas essentially says that anyone could sign on it. That's essentially Ben Nanas' shita. Again, Rabbi Akiva holds, no, only a karov. A relative could sign, and Rabbi Akiva is makel by a karov because a karov still technically is kasher le'edos. A karov ultimately, again, is permitted to give testimony. Just he happens to be precluded because of this particular circumstance, because he's related to the husband in this situation. But lemaisa, again, he's permitted to go ahead and testify everywhere else. So it says the Gemara, Amrli Rabbi Zera L'Rabba Bar Shilta. Rabbi Zera said to Rabbi Bar Shilta, Michti, Kol Shlosha B'Mekusher, Kishnayim B'Pashatami. So let's analyze this. 3 signatures on a get mekusher are essentially the equivalent of 2 signatures on a regular get, right? Just like a regular get needs at least 2 signatures, so a get mekusher requires at least 3 signatures. Ma hasam karov lo. So I would have thought in the same way that a regular get, a relative cannot go ahead and sign the get. So I would have thought the same thing over here, namely that in a get makush, a relative shouldn't be able to sign the get as well. Amrlei, Afli Kashali. I had the same question. And I asked Rav Hamnuna, and Rav Hamnuna asked Rav Barava, and he said to me, leave it alone, meaning again, you should be able to have apostle witness sign on a get makusha. Why? Because the signatures by get makusha are not da'araisa, rather again, they are only derabanan. Therefore, again, there's leniency. That supports this. Get kereach. Supposed to remember again the bold get. The bold get is a get makusher that's missing signatures, either signature or signatures on its folds. So get kereach, kisharav shiva, ve'id of shisha. So let's say you have 7 folds, but only 6 witnesses. So that namely there's one fold empty, or shisha ve'id of chamisha, or I have 6 folds, but only 5 witnesses. Chamisha ve'id of arba, 5 folds, 4 witnesses. Arba ve'id of shlosha, 4 folds, 3 witnesses. Ad kan machlokes Ben Nanas Rabbi Akiva. So they all say, up until this point, this is the machlokes Rabbi Akiva and Ben Nanas. So remember, again, Rabbi Akiva Ben Nanas, the Gemara wants to suggest, only argue regarding fold number 4 and above. However, again, because what do they say? Hishlim alav eved. Ben Nanas Omer Havlad Kasher. So according to Ben Nanas, anyone could sign on that 4th fold and on, even an Eved. And if she got remarried, the offspring from the second marriage are Kasher. Rabbi Akiva Omer Havlad Mamzer. But Rabbi Akiva, on the other hand, says that no, the child is a Mamzer. Aval Ksharav Shlosha, Ve'id of Shnayim. But Rabbi say, if you have 3 folds, and 2 signatures, i.e. there's one more signature that needs to be filled in. And if you remember again, why is 3 the magic number? Because 3 ultimately, again, is the minimum number of signatures for a get makusher. Divrei hakol ein mashlimin alav elakarov. Everyone agrees that what? That the fourth fold can only be signed by a relative. Now again, so I realized somebody asked this yesterday, so I didn't say this clearly. When we say it can only be signed by a relative, it doesn't mean you have to use a relative, meaning you can use a kosher witness. What it means is it can even be signed by a relative. And not only that, but although we allow you to relax the laws of testimony, of edus, for this particular get, for the third fold, it's only released to us, it's only relaxed to a certain degree. You could use a karov, you could use a relative, but you can't use anyone else. From fold number 3 and on, meaning 4 and above, that's where the machlokas in Rabbi Akiva and Bananas kicks in. Bananas at that point then says pretty much you could use anyone you want to fill in the blanks. Rabbi Akiva on the other hand says still you could only use a relative. So the Gemara says, Rav Yosef Masni Kosher. Rav Yosef said no, that the third witness on a get makusher has to be someone who's kosher. V'hatanya karov, but the Brisa says you can even use a relative. Papa Tani kosher. So Rav Papa said change it to kosher. Okay, so Rav Papa literally holds that the third witness has to be a kosher as well. Amar Rabbi Yochanan lo huchshuru bo ela eidechad karov bilvad. So Rabbi Yochanan says furthermore, in the get makusher, no matter how many folds you have, the most you can use is what? Is one karov, one relative. Aval trey lo. But you can't use 2 krovim. You can't use 2 witnesses to someone to get makusher. Well, because remember again, a get makusher could have any number of folds. So let's say I have 10 folds. So Rabbi Yochanan said at most you could only use one relative and not more. Why? Dilma asi likiyume bitrei krovim. There is a concern about what happens if the validity of this get is called into question, and they have to validate the get by validating the signatures. If it turns out that you have two relatives, 2 krovim on that get, remember again, kiyum shtaros could be done by 3 different signatures, and it could very well be, or even 2 signatures. It could be that the 2 signatures of the krovim will be used to uphold the get, and therefore it turns out that the get is being upheld through signatures who are not really fit to be real witnesses. Therefore, in order to avoid that, the maximum number of relative signatures that we can have is 1. Says the Gemara, Amarav Ashi, Masnisa Navideka, our Mishnah supports this assertion as well, Tavav Peibeis, to Kamedaleg Vitani Chad Chad. Because also what's interesting is, remember, how did the Brisa set up its case? The Brisa said, you have 7 folds and 6 witnesses. 6 folds, 5 witnesses. The most that the Brisa did was only leave what? 1 space open. And that was to make a point that you could only go ahead and have 1 witness, 1 karov sign on a get makusher. You can't have more than 1 karov. To which the Gemara says, Shmamina. Indeed, see that this is correct. That Lamaisa, again, at most you could have is 1 karov who goes ahead and signs on the get. So the Gemara says the following: Amar Abaye, Shmamina. So Shmamina, hi karov. Sorry. Amar Abaye, Shmamina. Learn from this. Hi karov chasim ibay bein betchila bein beemtza bein besof. So Abaye says, now that we've established that at most you could only have 1 karov, 1 witness who signs, now what we also see from our Mishnah is the karov could sign anywhere he wants. If he wants to sign at the beginning of the shtar, or at the beginning of the get, the middle of the get, the end of the get, how do we know this? Mimai midelo kava le makom. Good morning, Mr. Schoenfeld. Baruch haba. Baruch haba. Welcome. So the Gemara says, how do we know this? So good to have you back. Hat and all. So says the Gemara. How do we know this? Because again, the Gemara says, from the fact that we did not go ahead and establish a particular place in which the karov has to sign. Ushmamina mikol tlasa mekaiminon velo ba'inon resufin. Furthermore, again, so Bai says, first of all, the same way that we learned from the diak of the Mishnah that only 1 karov could sign, what we also learn is that what? The karov could sign anywhere that he wants. Next idea, Ushmamina mikol tlasa mekaiminon. You could go ahead and uphold the get, meaning I will say, remember, Rashi describes this process on the bottom of Amud Beis. This is if, remember, let's say the husband raises doubts about the authenticity of the get. So there's a concept ultimately again of kiyum shtaros, which means again, now let's say the witnesses are not there to testify about the get either. We'll bring in other people to go ahead and testify that they recognize 3 of the signatures on the get. And once you uphold 3 of the signatures, then by definition the get is upheld. So the Gemara says, you see from here that you could go ahead and choose any 3 random signatures to uphold the get. V'lo ba'inon ritzufin. and you do not require 3 contiguous signatures. How do we know that? Because if it was true that you needed 3 contiguous signatures, so the likaba le makom haikara betchilo be'emso v'sof v'lechsher beituva. Kisvikmar says, because listen to this. How do we know that you could choose any 3 signatures? Because if you had to choose 3 contiguous signatures, let's say from the beginning or from the end or from the middle, so then I have an easy way. I could go ahead and I could use multiple krovim to go ahead and sign on the shtar. How? Because let's establish again which witnesses you're going to use for kiyum shtaros purposes. 3 from the beginning, 3 from the end, 3 from the middle, and just what? And just to make sure that the krovim don't sign in those areas. The fact that we don't say that tells us what? That lamaisa, again, that the krovim could sign anywhere on the shtar. So I'll say, so we come out with 3 ideas. Number 1, maximum 1 karov. Number 2, the krovim could sign anywhere that they want. And number 3, when trying to uphold this get, if it's contested, you could uphold it by validating any 3 of the signatures, and the signatures need not be contiguous. The Gemara ends off with a statement, Ki aslu kamei Rabbi Ami, Amarle, say v'hishtam alav even min hashuk. So it's interesting enough, so apparently they had to get makusher, and the get makusher had a blank in it, and Rabbi Ami instructed his attendant, go and find an eved, a slave from the marketplace, and he could fill in the final blank. Ultimately, again, paskening like benanos. So the point of that story was to say that at least Rabbi Ami paskin like benanos over Rabbi Akiva, that for a get makusher, even anyone could go ahead and sign on it.
But when we talk karov, do we mean his karov or her karov?
It's either one. Either one. Anyone who's related to the...
One of his and one of her?
No. 1 karov in total. 1 related party to the parties in total. Hadrun Allah Hazorik. Hamagarish Ishto. We'll say new parak. Man divorces his wife, Amar law, Hariat mutaris l'chol adam ela leploni. So man divorces his wife and he says, you are permitted to every man. Ella, now we'll see, this word is actually an intriguing word. Ella, we'll translate it as except for Ploni. So you're permitted to every man, except to Reuven. Rabbi Eliezer Mati, Rabbi Eliezer says the get is good. The Chacham say the get is not good. Keitza Yaseh, so what should you do to remedy this get? Yitlana Hemenu, take it back from her. V'yachzer v'yitnen Allah, v'yomer la hari'at mutaras l'chol adam. So go ahead and take it back from her, and just simply make another verbal declaration that says you are permitted to every man. Kasvu b'socho. So what happens? So I will say, so case number 1 is where there was a verbal tanai. So he gives her the get and he says, you are permitted to every person, ela leploni, except to Ruvain. Okay? So Rabbi Eliezer says, the get is good. Chacham say the get's not good. You have to take it back and re-give it without the verbal tanai. However, if the condition was written in the get itself, so let's say in the get itself it's written, hari'at mutaris v'chol adam chutz miploni, then what? Afapi shechazar umachko, even though the husband went back and erased the t'nai, pasal. The get is still pasal. Because also again, remember, even if you erased it, it doesn't make a difference. Now again, there are ways in which you could erase or make changes within a shtar, but simply erasing a clause will not go ahead and validate the shtar. Says the Gemara, Bailahu. Hi Ella. So we'll say, so here's what's interesting. The Mishnah employs a very fascinating lashon over here. Hari'at mutaris l'chol adam Ella leploni. So the Gemara says, what does Ella mean? Chutzu, does Ella mean except? So what the husband essentially is saying is, you are hereby permitted to every man except to Ruvain, chutz mi ploni, o almanas. Or is Ella a lashon of condition? That this is your get on the condition that you do not marry Ruvain. So you'll see to yourself, what does it matter? It matters, you'll see in just a moment. So the Gemara says the following. Chutzu, on one hand we could say it's chutz. Ubechutzu dupligi Rabban Rabbi Eliezer. Dahashir la beget. So it could be that if you understand that Ella means chutz, except, then really this is the machlokes the Rabbanon and Rabbi Eliezer. The Rabbanon, Rabbi Eliezer says the get is good, and the Rabbanon say the get is not good. Why? Shir beget. Rabbanon says shir beget. We know get operates with many basic premises, but one major premise, which is it must be a sefer krisus. It must be a book of division. And it must be a book ultimately, again, that divides between him and her. Therefore, if he retains any marital power over her, by definition, again, it's not considered to be a valid get. So therefore the Chachamim will say the following: if the husband says to wife, "This is your get," you are permitted to every man except Ruvain, what he is doing is he's retaining some level of marital power over her. If that's the case, then it's not a proper get. Aval ba'al menas module midi dehavia kol tunai da'alma. But when it comes to almanas, I will say even the Rabbanan would agree. So, for example, if a man were to say to his wife, this is your get on the condition that you don't marry Ruvain. So we'll say, interestingly enough, in that case, the Rabbanan would agree that the get is a good get. Why? Because it's a t'nai, and it's a t'nai like any other t'nai. Just like a husband could give his wife a t'nai on the condition that she give me $1 million. That's a t'nai. He could also put a condition that you don't marry Ruvain. And interestingly enough, that is not considered to be a withholding of marital rights. That's considered to be a t'nai. And so look at Rashi. About ba'al menas modu, Rabbanan de beget lo shir. The rabbis will agree that if he phrases it as a t'nai, that the get will be valid. She'tira b'mesiras haget l'chol adam. Because technically speaking, the giving of the get, look at this distinction that Rashi makes. The giving of the get is a good giving of the get, because the actual get itself is one that permits her to all men. Ella shehisna ima amanash lo tinasi lazeh. But rather again, so what Rashi is doing is, when there's a t'nai, so we make a distinction. What's the distinction? Between the get itself and the condition. So the get is an absolutely valid get. There are no limitations on the get itself. It's just that there's an additional t'nai that is attached between husband and wife. If she chooses to accept that t'nai, that is of her own volition. So what the Gemara is making the distinction is the following. When a man goes in and says to his wife, what he's really doing is he's altering the nature and quality of the divorce. Whereas the divorce goes ahead and technically permits her to all men, he is limiting the scope of that divorce. That, according to the Rabbanan, won't be good. But when he gives her a get with a t'nai, the divorce itself is a regular divorce. It happens to be she and she are choosing to add on an additional, when I say she's choosing, because if she accepts, she's also choosing to add on an additional condition to the agreement. But the agreement, or in this case, the get, by definition is totally valid. That's one possibility to explain this machlokes. That they're only arguing ultimately again in they're arguing in chutz. They're arguing in chutz, but with almenas, even the Rabbanon would agree that it would be a good get. Odil, but the other possibility is almenasu. That really, again, the Mishnah's case of Ella is a case of almenas. It's a condition. Uba almenasu the pligi Rabbi Eliezer the Rabbanon. And in the case of almenas, that's where there's machlokes in Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanon. Aval b'chutz modeh the hashir la beget. But I will say in the case of chutz, even Rabbi Eliezer would agree that the get is not good, because Lamais, again, he's altered the entire nature of the divorce. So we'll say, we're just trying to figure out what the word Ella means. Does Ella mean chutz, or does Ella mean almenas? So listen to this. Amar Ravina, I'm going to prove to you what Ella means. Tashma, kol habatim etamen b'negoyim Ella shel ovdei kochavim. So the Brisa says, all homes can be afflicted with tzaras. Ella sounds like except. Ella, the homes of Ovdei Kochavim, of idolaters. So, Amrit B'Shlama Chutzu Shapir. So I'll say, if you understand that the word Ella means chutz, except, then this brisa makes sense. Because what is it saying? All Jewish homes are afflicted by tzaras, except the homes of idolaters. Ella means chutz. Ella Amrit Amenasu. But if you want to say that Ella means on the condition, Amenas delo metamu bate Ovdei Kochavim, hametame bate Yisrael. So the Gemara says, read that again. Amenas lo metami bate ovdei kochavim. Hu di metami bate Yisrael. Hametamu bate ovdei kochavim lo metami bate Yisrael. Are you saying then it's on the condition that Gentile homes don't become tamei, that Jewish homes become tamei with saras? So telling me then that if Gentile homes were to contract to a saras, that Jewish homes would not. First of all, it doesn't make sense. Va'od Furthermore, we know that non-Jewish homes do not become afflicted with tzaras. How do we know that, Tanya? V'nasati negat saras bebeis eretz achuzaschem. The pasuk says, "I will put the affliction of saras in the homes of the land of your holding." Eretz achuzaschem etama benegoim ve'im bate ovdei kochavim etam benegoim. It is only your land that could become tameh with saras, but not the homes of idolaters. Ella, so we'll say bottom line, shma mina chutzu. But rather, Rabbi say, see that at the end of the day, Ella means chutz. Ella means accept. Therefore, for the purposes of our Mishnah, what's happening over here? The man is saying to his wife, "You are divorced. You're permitted to every single man chutz miploni, except for so and so." So again, the Rabbanon will say that gerushin is not valid. Why? Because he is altering the nature and the scope of the divorce process itself. Now, why Rabbi Eliezer holds that it's good is something we'll have to discuss. To which the Gemara says, "Shma mina chutzu, shma mina." Masnisin delo ki aitana. So the Gemara just says, our Mishnah does not reflect the view of the following Tana. This Sanya, Am Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Huda, lo nechlaku Rabbi Eliezer, v'chachamim ala megariv shesishto, v'amar lo hari'at mutaris l'chol adam chutz miploni, she'ena migareshes. So we'll say, so here comes along Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Huda and says that the machlokas in Rabbi Eliezer and the chachamim is not in a case where the man says, you are permitted to every man chutz miploni. Everyone agrees she'ena migareshes. Everyone agrees, we'll say in that case, that she is not migreshes. Now remember, that stands in contradistinction to the Mishnah. That's why the Gemara is saying, our Mishnah does not reflect the view of the Tana of this Braisa. Because in this Braisa, the Tana is saying that in the case of chutz, right, if a man says, you are permitted to every single man except to Ruvain, both Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan will agree that the gerushin is not good. Aman nechalku, what do they disagree about? Al megarish ishto v'amrla hari'at mutaris l'chol adam al menas shelo tisi laploni shetinasi laploni. Rather, again, what they argue about is the following case, where a husband says to his wife, you are permitted to every man on the condition that you do not go ahead and marry Ploni. So we'll say, so understand over here, so essentially, according to this Tana, the argument between Rabbi Elazar and the Rabbanan is not in the case of chutz. In the case of chutz, everyone agrees that the divorce is not good. Their machlokes is rather about the case of almanas. Pay base, Rabbi Eliezer matir l'chol adam chutz mi osaish v'chachamim osrim. Rabbi Eliezer says that in the case of almanas, the get is a valid get, and again she's divorced, and again the t'nai is still there, so she can't marry Ruvain, but the rest of the get is good, and the Chachamim say no, such a get is not good. So let's analyze this. My time at the Rebbe Lazar. So what is Rebbe Lazar's logic? Says the Gemara. My time at the Rebbe Lazar, second line, pay base on the base. Midi dehavi akol t'nai da'alma. Because it's no different than any other t'nai. It's no different than any other Tanai. Just like in general, again, when you have a Tanai, also like we just said before, remember, we'll say this is the interesting chiluk the Gemara is making by Tanai. What we assume is that when a man goes ahead and tells his wife, this is your get on the condition you don't marry Ruvain, in reality, that's no different than saying this is your get on the condition you give me $1,000. It's the same thing. In other words, that there's the get, and the get itself is a proper vehicle of divorce, and there is a side agreement or a side condition. But that side condition does not actually undermine the validity of the get. Although we will see that there are conditional cases that do undermine the validity, but for our purposes now, we'll assume it doesn't. But the Rabbanan will say, Kol t'nai da'alma lo shir le beget. Hacha shir le beget. The Rabbanan say, excuse me, Rabbi Lazar, you're burying your head in the sand. That's true, meaning when does t'nai work? T'nai works when it doesn't affect the get in a material sense. So for example, man says to his wife, this is your get on the condition that you give me $10,000. Okay, he is attaching a financial stipulation. Does that financial stipulation in any way affect the terms of the get? No. This is your get on the condition you don't go to visit your father for the next year. Okay, it keeps some strings attached, but does it materially affect the nature of the get? And the answer is no. The Rabbanan will say over here, when you're making a tanai about who she can marry, that materially affects the nature of the get. The essence of a get is what? Hari'at mutaris chodron. We'll say, remember again, remember, there are two operative phrases in life. Hari'at mikudeshas li, and hari'at mutaris l'chol adam. Right? Those are the two sides of, Otherwise, we shouldn't have the other side of the coin. But those are two sides of the same coin. One phraseology creates exclusivity, and the other side of the coin ultimately creates the license to every man. The Chachamim will say, if you tamper with Hare'at Muteris L'chol Adam, you are undermining and tampering with the very essence of the get. So don't give me this distinction that the get is good, but there's a secondary Tanai. The Rabbanan will say this Tanai destroys the get. Umasnisin dukim nebachutz. My time with Rabbi Lazar. Now, so now the Gemara goes back. So remember, that brisa is set up to machlokes between Rabbi Lazar and the Rabbanon as dealing with a case of almanas. We established before that the Mishnah's case of the machlokes Rabbi Lazar and the Rabbanon is in a case of chutz. They're arguing in chutz. Right? That halacha l'maaseh, if a man says to his wife, "Harei at mutaras l'chol adam chutz miploni," the Rabbanon will say the get is not valid because there you're undermining the very get itself. And Rabbi Eliezer says the get is good. To which the Gemara now says, my time with Rabbi Eliezer. Why does Rabbi Eliezer hold that? I will say, because that's a strange halacha, it's a strange ruling, strange position. That Lamaisa, again, if a husband says to his wife, this is your get, chutz miploni, that the get is good. Why would Rabbi Eliezer hold like this? Because Rabbi Eliezer darshans a pasuk. What's the pasuk? V'yatsa mi beso, v'haisa li shacher. The pasuk says by divorce, she will leave his home, meaning she'll leave the current husband's home, v'haisa li shacher, and she will be a wife to another man. Afilu lo hitira ela li ish acher, harezu migureshes. So let's see, because Rabbi Eliezer has a very interesting drasha. The pasuk says, when the husband divorces his wife, she will leave his home and go to another man. Even if the divorce only permits her to one other man, nevertheless, what? The divorce is valid. So therefore, Rabbi Eliezer actually holds that Lamaisa, again, even if he literally says, Hari'at mutaris l'chol adam, chutz miploni, such a get is still a valid get. Why? Because although the husband is not permitting her to marry Ploni, that's the condition, or that's the statement, nevertheless, what? She's permitted to marry everyone else. And therefore, as long as a get allows for her to marry other men, again, the get will be valid. The Rabbanon will say, Hai ish, l'chol ish v'ish. She will say, on the other hand, the Rabbanon say, no, ish acher means what? That a get is only valid if she is permitted to every ish acher, to every other man. So the fundamental machlokes in Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanon essentially seems to be, according to the Gemara, how to darshan that phrase ish acher. Rabbi Eliezer says, as long as she is permitted to ish acher, to at least one other person, and the Rabbanon will say, no, ish acher means what? It means lamaisa again, every other person. So it says the Gemara, so let me just finish, then I'll take it. So it says the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Taimad, Rabbi Eliezer Mihacha, Rabbi Yochanan says, that the logic of Rabbi Eliezer is from here. It's from here. So Mihacha, the Isha, Grusha me Isha, Lo Yikacha. So both said this pasuk is actually by the Kahuna. So remember again, this is saying by a Kohen, that a Kohen is not permitted to marry a divorcee. So what does it mean? The Isha, Grusha me Isha, Lo Yikachu. A woman divorced from her husband. She may not be, a Kohen may not marry. Afilu lo nisgarsha ela me Isha, nifsa mina kahuna. So what the pasuk is teaching me is that even if a woman was only divorced from her husband, and also what does it mean only divorced from her husband? Meaning even if the husband placed a stipulation on the get that said, you're divorced from me, hari'at mutaris l'chol chutz mi ploni, so she's not even permitted to everyone, but she's prohibited to her husband, so the halacha is nifsa mina kahuna. She is not permitted to marry into the kahuna. Alma havigita. From here we see Rabbi say that's what? That Lamaisa, again, even a get that does not permit her to every single person is still what? Is still a get. Now the way we're seeing it doesn't permit to every single person is because we're assuming that if it prohibits her to the kahuna, then by definition it means that it's a valid get. But the Rabbanan will say, no. Isser kahuna shiny. Just because a woman is not permitted to marry a Kohen does not automatically mean that's what? That her get was a valid get. So we saw that yesterday. Because remember again, we saw Machlokes Hashem. So that what happens if a husband writes a get, but didn't deliver it? There's even a havamina that's what? That the actual act of writing a get, by definition, passes her further kahuna because of reach haget, the scent of a get. The scent of a get. So therefore the Rabbanon will say, just because a particular type of get may disqualify her from the kahuna, does not automatically mean that it's a valid divorce. In other words, what the Gemara, what the Rabbanon are saying over here, is that there are certain gittin, this is actually quite interesting, we'll see this, there are certain gittin which are technically possible, technically don't work, but are real enough to prevent her ultimately from marrying into the Kahuna. To which the Gemara will say, so therefore again, if we stop over here, what the Gemara is suggesting is the following. That remember, first of all, two different versions in the Machlokes in Rabbi and the Rabbanon. One version has them arguing in Almanas, that they're arguing about the condition. If the husband attaches a condition to the get, this is your get on the condition you don't marry Ruvain. Rabbi Elazar says the get is good. Why is the get good? Because it's a Tanai. And I will say the beauty of Tanai is the get itself is a proper vehicle for divorce. There's a secondary condition attached to it, but the secondary condition does not undermine the intact tenets of the get. The Rabbanan say, come on, that's ridiculous. You know that this Tanai tampers with the very fundamentals of the get by limiting who she is permitted to marry. So says the Gemara, fine, I understand the Shita of the Rab. Now, I will say that's in the Brisa. The Mishnah, however, has them arguing in a different way. The Mishnah has them arguing on chutz. That again, according to our Mishnah, if it was a condition, everyone would agree that the get is good. What they're arguing about is a case of chutz. Hari'at mutaris l'chol adam chutz miploni. Rabbi Elazar says the get is good. The Rabbanan say the get is not good. So Rabbanan, we understand. We understand because he's tampering with the very safer krisos. But according to Rabbi Elazar, why is the get good? To which the Gemara essentially suggests it's Xer Sakas, if he dashes the pasuk. And the inference from the psukim seems to be that as long as the get either permits her to some man, or as long as the get li'ishacher, as long as it permits her to some man, or as long as the get goes ahead and essentially allows her to be prohibited to the kuna, it's a proper get, even if it doesn't permit her to everyone else. To which the Gemara now asks the follow-up question. So I'll say, what about the parallel case in Kiddushin? So take a look at Rashi. B'Kiddushin Heich is actually very interesting. Hiskadshi li le'asar l'chol adam chutz miploni. So we'll say, listen to this. This is the parallel case in Kiddushin. A man says, Hari'at mikudeshas li chutz miruvein. Now, what does that mean? You are mikudeshes to me, which means you are aser to every other man except Ruvain. Except Ruvain. So we'll say, so the shaila is, what does such a kid? I'm sorry. Oh, so right. So what does such a kiddushin do? What does such a kiddushin do? To which the Gemara says, well, in this case, tiboy Rabbi Elazar, tiboy the Rabbanon. But say this will be a kasha both according to Rabbanon and both according to Rabbi Elazar. How so? Tiboy Rabbi Elazar. Ad kamo kam Rabbi Elazar hacha ela mishum dechsivi kroi. So I could say that the reason by Gittin, where Rabbi Eliezer allows for a get that says chutz mi ploni is why? Because there's a pasuk. Because the pasuk says v'yatsa mi beiso v'haisa li'ish acher. The pasuk says that technically speaking, as long as she could marry another man, technically speaking, the get is good. However, aval hasam, but over there by kiddushin, kinyan ma'al yoba'inon. We need a proper kinyan. We need a proper kinyan kiddushin. I will say proper kinyan kiddushin means what? Exclusivity. It means that she has to be prohibited to every single man. Odom, the other possibility is v'yatsa v'haisa. What's v'yatsa v'haisa? V'yatsa v'haisa is the limud by which we compare Gittin and Kiddushin. And therefore perhaps if this type of exclusionary phrase works by Gittin, it should work by Kiddushin as well. Tibay the Rabbanon. Let's ask according to the Rabbanon. Ad kan lo kamer Rabbanon hacha ella deba'inon krisos v'leka. So the reason the Rabbanon don't allow the case of chutz miploni by divorce is why? Because Gittin must be a complete division. And therefore, if the husband retains some level of say over who she can marry, it's not a sefer krisos. Aval hasam kinyan kolduhu. But maybe by kiddushin, all I need is any kind of kinyan, even an incomplete one. And therefore, again, if he says hari'at mikudeshas li chutz mi Ruvain, it should be good. Oh, Dilma v'yatsa v'haisa. Or perhaps again, even the Rabbanon will say we compare Gittin and Kiddushin, and just like by Gittin, chutz mi ploni does not work, so too again by Kiddushin, chutz mi ploni does not work as well. To which the Gemara says, bless you, after the Gemara asked the kasha, Hadir Pashta, the Gemara then answered it. Bein l'Rabbi Eliezer, bein l'Rabbanon, ba'inan v'yatsa v'haisa. Both according to Rabbi Elazar and the Rabbanon, we require v'yatsa v'haisa, which Shabbosai means that both according to the Rabbanon and Rabbi Eliezer, the shitos that they have by Gerushin will ultimately trickle into their understandings by Kiddushin as well. So the same principles that play out by Gittin will play out by Kiddushin. Look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, Rashi says, Hadar Pashta ben Rabbi Elazar, The Rabbi Lazar have a kiddushin, the Rabbanan lo have a kiddushin. And therefore, again, the Gemara says that Lamaisa, Rabbi Lazar will hold, just like Rabbi Lazar holds, Hari Zegiteich, or I should say, Hari Ak Mutaris L'chol Adam Chutz Mi Ploni. Rabbi Eliezer holds that it's a good gerushin. So too Hari Ak Nikudesh Esli Chutz Mi Ploni will also be a good kiddushin. And according to the Rabbanon who say Hari Ak Mutaris L'chol Adam Chutz Mi Ploni is not a good divorce, will also say Hari Ak Nikudesh Esli Chutz Mi Ruvain is also not a good marriage. So the Gemara says, Amar Abaye. So Abaye says, Imtin Salomar Isa L'Rabbi Abba. So Abaye says, if you want to say that the halacha really follows Rabbi Abba, that literally again both Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanon will go ahead and hold their respective shitos, not just by Gittin, but by Kiddushin as well. Ba Ruvain v'Kidsha, listen to this case. Ba Ruvain v'Kidsha chutz mishimin. So we'll say, if Ruvain comes along and says, Hari'at nikudesh asli chutz mishimin, which I will say sounds very strange, but essentially what it does is it opens the window for Shimon to be mekadesh this woman. Because essentially what Reuben is saying is, you are married to me lagabe every other man except for Shimon. Okay? Then what happens? Ba Shimon v'kidsha chutz mi Reuven. And then I will say, what happens? Shimon comes along and is mekadesher, right? And he says, you are mekudeshes to me. You are prohibited to every other man except Reuven. Except Reuven. So I will say, so it says the Gemara, if you think this is complicated, it gets a little bit more complicated. How so? Because let's say they're brothers. Reuven and Shimon are brothers. And what happens? Umeisu shnehem, and they both die. So after Kiddushin, misyavemes leLevi. She's able to do yibum with Levi. Ve'ein ani koreba eshes shnei mesim. And I don't go ahead and call her the wife of two dead men. Now I will say, this is actually very interesting. If you look at Rashi says over ve'ein ani koreba eshes shnei mesim la osra leLevi mipnei zeka shnei yavin. I will say, as we're going to see, Rashi is going to point out this case. You're going to remember from Yevamis, there's a situation where if a woman is technically speaking somehow maritally connected to two men, there is no yibum, right? Zeko, exactly. So look at Rashi. Rashi says, this not be Yevamis. Mr. Schoenfeld, you see, first day back, your son says a bomb idea. Incredible. It's your zechus. So he's been quiet this whole time. Where's my father coming back? Mamish. Now, so says the Gemara. So this nan be Yevamis, shlosha achin. Listen to this case. So we'll say, three brothers, umeis echem, one of them died. So we'll say one of them died, married without children. Va'asa hasheni ma'amar, b'yevimto. And now we'll say, so let's say Reuven, Shimon, Levi. Reuven dies without children. His widow falls to his brothers. So watch this. We'll say one of the brothers did ma'amar. Remember we learned about ma'amar. What's ma'amar? Ma'amar is like kiddushin. So one of the brothers says, I'm going to marry you. I'm going to do yibum with you. I will say on a biblical level, that's meaningless, because the only thing that affects yibum ultimately is bia. But nevertheless, he makes a verbal declaration that he's going to marry her. So what happens? Umeis. And then the brother who said he was going to do yibum, who did ma'amar, died. So what's the halacha? Choletzes v'lo misyavemes. Shabbosai, she does chalitza and not yibum with brother number 3. Why? Shene'emar umeis echad mehem yavamu yava aleha mi shaleh zekas yavam echad v'lo sha'aleha zekas shnei yavmin kagon zu. So we'll say, so listen to this. What the Gemara says is special gzeres hakasav, that if a man dies and a woman is maritally connected to more than one man, there is no din of yibum. So let's watch this case. Rachel is married to Reuven. Reuven dies without children. Reuven has 2 surviving brothers. Let's say Shimon and Levi. Shimon says to Rachel, I'm going to do yibum with you. Hari'at mikudesh esli. He does what we call ma'amar. Then what happens? Shimon dies. The halacha is that Rachel does not do yibum with Levi, with the 3rd surviving brother. Why? Because at the time of Shimon's death, Rachel had a marital connection to 2 men. What was her marital connection to 2 men? Obviously, again, her connection to her deceased husband, Reuven. I take that back. What's her marital connection to 2 men? The marital connection between Shimon and Levi. Because remember, again, both of those brothers were maritally connected to the widow, to Rachel, because both of them had an obligation of yibum. the fact that Shimon did ma'amar, we'll say ma'amar on a biblical level is meaning, it's like an intent. Ma'amar like lahavdil today is like engagement. When you get engaged to a woman, so that is halachically meaningless. That's a promise to marry, but it's not binding. It doesn't do anything. So l'maisa, again, that's a case, that's called an eshes shnei mesim, and there's no yibum. So the Gemara says over here, in this case where Reuven says, you are mikudeshes to me chutz mi Shimon, and Shimon says, you are mikudeshes to me chutz mi Reuven, and then they both die, she could do yibum with Levi, and she's not called an eshes shnei mesim. My time, well, what's the reason for that? Kiddushay de Reuven ahanu, because we won't say the kiddushay of Reuven works. Kiddushay de Shimon lo ahanu. The kiddushin of Shimon ultimately does not work. We'll say, why does the kiddushin of Shimon not work? Now Rashi actually points out, just says outside, this is actually quite interesting, because the kiddushin of Shimon did not actually go ahead and add anything on, did not prohibit anything additional above and beyond the kiddushin of Reuven. Because remember, what's the kiddushin of Reuven? Hari'at mutaris l'cho adam chutz mi Shimon. Chutz mi Shimon. What does the kiddushin of Shimon do? The kiddushin of Shimon goes ahead and says, Hari'at mutaris l'chol adam chutz mi Reuven. So we'll say, what did Shimon accomplish through his kiddushin? Nothing. Meaning, the way we measure the effectiveness of kiddushin is who does this kiddushin aser her to? If the kiddushin doesn't aser her to anyone, then by definition the kiddushin is not valid. Shimon's kiddushin did not go ahead and add anything to Reuven's kiddushin, because Reuven already created the allowance that she could accept kiddushin from Shimon. Shimon's kiddushin created the allowance that she could accept kiddushin from Reuven, which she already did. Therefore, from a halachic perspective, Shimon's kiddushin didn't add anything. Therefore, again, when both of these men die, she's not considered to be the wife, so to speak, of two men, because kiddushin number 2 was not really effective. Kiddushin number 1 was. We'll say we'll stop over here. Again, we're stopping a little bit like mid-discussion, but what the Gemara is going to pick up with tomorrow is the paradigmatic case of Esha Shnei Mesim. But again, understand what it is that we are leaving off in the middle of. First of all, leaving still off in the middle of this machlokes in Rabbi Elazar and the Rabbana. Namely, again, at what level is a husband permitted to go ahead and retain some say over who she can marry or not? Machlokes in Rabbi Elazar and the Rabbanan, both in the case of almanas as well as in the case of chutz. So I'm going to say, just to share with you a short idea on the parsha.